Hi, I'm Sam Blows, and I'm a moderator today for Co-Parenting and Coffee, and I'm quite honored to introduce to you our special guest, Dr. Jessica Kendorski, PhD. She's a professor, department chair, and clinician, and she's joining us today to talk about 5 stressors impacting co-parents and kids. She received her PhD from Temple University, is a licensed psychologist who maintains certifications as a board-certified behavior analyst and nationally certified school psychologist. She actively works with school districts to improve systems for all students through the reform of school and district-wide academic and behavioral policies and practices. Dr. Kendorski also works with parents and families in the development of supportive home environments and overall parent, child, and family well-being. Dr. Kendorski, I believe you have extensive experience, correct, supporting social, emotional, and behavioral development in children. If you would introduce yourselves to us a little bit, that would be lovely.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. So yes, I do work primarily at the university level in the school psych department. So training future school psychologists, but I also work with children and families and schools to work on the environments with which kids are in, whether it be in the school or be in the home, to promote their social and emotional development.
Oh, lovely. And I believe you have children of your own, is that correct?
I do. I have a daughter who is 13, and I have a son who is 11. And I have been co parenting for 4 years.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I appreciate your passion for the topic and your
Mhm.
advocacy as well for these positive parenting practices.
Yes, definitely.
So we got some questions I'd like to ask you today. Some questions about communication, about transitioning in a co-parenting situation. But maybe a good way for me to start off is to ask you, how do you feel that bad communication between co-parents affects the mental health of the parents, but also of the children?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, what we know in terms of the research when it comes to divorce and the mental health of the children and how they are impacted, but also the mental health of the parents, is the number one stressor is usually the conflict, right? So,
Mm.
high conflict divorce is what results in some of these negative consequences. And usually, with that conflict, it comes down to communication. So, thinking about the way we communicate with the co-parent, but also thinking about the way that we communicate with our children. So I think initially, when there is kind of that separation, we as parents want to protect our children. So we may not communicate with them as much. But what we forget sometimes is that they pick up on everything. They see everything we do, they see our interaction with the other parent, they see it, right? So we're not necessarily protecting them by not communicating with them. So with kids, we want to be developmentally appropriate and tell them exactly what's going on. Your younger kids are going to have no idea. They're just going to be confused as to what two houses may mean. Your middle school kids might blame themselves. They might think that they were the reason for it. Your older kids might start to get angry. Your teenagers might start to get angry. That it might impact the way they view relationships later on. So keeping those lines of communication open, noticing if you see things in them, asking them questions, and letting them know in developmentally appropriate ways what things look like.
So then the temptation is to maybe not communicate because we're worried that it may be too much for them to understand or too much for them to handle at once. But actually, poor communication or even no communication is going to have a negative impact there, would you say?
Absolutely. So here's kids are very egocentric at all ages. So what they will do is and we all do it, we fill in gaps with our anxiety and our insecurity. So we create a story in our head. Our kids will create a story in our head. And if they see that mom's upset and they're not really sure, they're going to try and figure out a reason. And sometimes
Mm.
their reason is worse. So being able to say, you know what, mommy is upset right now, and I'm upset because I'm feeling like things are changing, but we're going to be okay, and you are safe, and here's what it's going to look like, and these are the coping strategies I'm going to engage in, that are appropriate so that I feel better.
That's good. So I feel like it's not good for us just to learn things to be more intelligent about the thing, but that we should also be able to apply it to our lives. Do you have any practical recommendations for communication with a co-parent or even with the children involved in the situation, of course?
Sure, absolutely. So with the co-parent, I would say, what I find helpful, what I think is typically helpful, is thinking about responding versus reacting,
Mm.
right? So if you have to give yourself a little bit of time and think, am I reacting to something, or am I going to wait a second and try and respond? Think about what it is that triggers you in a communication with a co-parent, right? So taking that extra step to kind of step back and say, I feel triggered here. Why do I feel triggered? Because there's lots of triggers. You feel out of control. You are typically, it's someone that knows exactly what will trigger you, right? You were married to this person before. So figuring out what it is that is triggering, asking questions, but in kind of non-defensive ways. So I've noticed this instead of you always do this. The funny thing is that
Mm.
the co-parenting communication is very similar to what marriage counseling would give you in terms of communication as well. It's the same thing. So you tend to see that the communication styles that may have impacted the marriage tend to impact, obviously, the co-parenting situation.
Okay, so we're saying here avoid superlatives. You always
Mhm.
do this, you never
Mhm.
do that, right? But then also be proactive about our communication. Uh, and of course, avoid reacting. And
Yes,
instead, yeah.
take that time to thoughtfully respond if you can. And then figure out what the goal is for the communication. So even
Mm,
thinking ahead of time, we're going to have this, I'm going to have this communication. My goal here is to figure out what we're doing for the holidays, right? So thinking about what that communication is so that you can keep going back to that goal. So if it is a situation where the conversation isn't going well, you can remind yourself, okay, I have a goal here. And you can
yeah.
kind of detach a little bit from it so that you can respond rather than react emotionally.
I love that intentionality rather than
Mhm.
just letting life happen and we're just rolling with the punches, instead being more intentional and seeing the purpose in that communication. That's quite interesting. Well, since you brought that up about holidays and special occasions, maybe that's a good opportunity for me to ask you a question about that, because special occasions like holidays and birthdays, it's a big deal for children usually. And so, what are some things that co parents can do surrounding that parenting agreement or maybe even the custody schedule to help children feel loved and supported during these very critical holidays?
I think it's really obviously going to depend on each individual situation and whether it could be a situation where you do have two parents that can be together in a room. Remember, with kids, their ultimate goal is that there are two parents that get along,
Mm,
right? So they really just want the low conflict. You ask kids what they're looking for, they really, at their core, just want parents that are able to get along, whether they're married or not. Usually, you will hear parents say post separation, post divorce, that really everything hits them during the holidays and during kind of kids' birthdays and these special occasions. And I think we forget sometimes that this is grief, and grief is a non-linear process. So sometimes we think grief is linear, right? We go through these steps, we wake up one day and we're okay, right? Grief doesn't work that way. Grief is good days and bad days. And a lot of times these holidays they will trigger that grief. They'll trigger that in our kids, but they'll also trigger that in us as co-parents. So acknowledging that we are going to feel that grief during those times. And again, communicating with our kids. What is hard about Christmas this year? What is good about Christmas this year? What would you like to see different? And then asking ourselves that as well. But acknowledging that it's tough, especially early on, because we are grieving the way things were and the way we thought they would be.
Yes, and I think we have such poignant memories of our own holidays during our childhood growing up. And of course, we want the best for our children and for them to have similar experiences that we have. So, how should co parents coordinate on things like gifts or communicate on the schedules for holidays or birthdays or transitioning from one home to another? Are there any guidelines that could be put in place?
I would say they're the same co-parenting guidelines that would extend throughout, right? So being open about that communication, being predictable with our kids and what we're going to do. Overall, with kids, it really comes down to they want to feel safe, they want to feel connected, and they want to feel empowered, right? So any situation when it comes to those transitions, thinking about those things, right? Safety is predictability. So what we're going to do for Thanksgiving this year is you're going to do this at one parent's house and you're going to do this at another parent's house, and letting them know what it's going to look like. Being okay with their big feelings. If their feelings are like, this is not okay, we always did this and now we can't, understanding that they are going to grieve that and that's okay. Asking them what it is that they would want to do so they feel like they have some agency. What can we do during this holiday that you're responsible for? What types of traditions could we do? We're grieving those old traditions, but having some excitement for the new ones for them, if you can. So saying, okay, I know that this is really tough, but this is going to be what we're going to do that's going to be super cool, and we're going to maintain that, or at least try. So kind of having them understand that life is about change, but being excited for some of the newer traditions.
That's really good. I like your phrase of new traditions, because rather than just grieving for the lost traditions, we can instead carve out some stability and predictability with new traditions.
Yeah, and it's great for our kids to start that now, and for even as us as co-parents, right? Because it's a huge change, but so is life. And so people tend to have to change up their traditions a lot, whether there's death or even what we all dealt with COVID. There were a bunch of people who were like, wait, I always spent Christmas this way and now I can't. So you're giving them those early kind of coping skills to deal with how things change and figuring out what it was about the tradition that was important to them and then making that occur. So if it was like, well, every year Grandpa read me a story right after Thanksgiving. So that's probably a connection kind of thing. So what can we do to kind of honor that, even if physically Grandpa can't read the story this year?
Yeah. Well, and of course, that means in a co-parenting situation that there's transition from one household and family group with a separate family group as well. And of course, in those holidays is where family typically congregates, and now we're talking about that separation. So with those transitions, how can children be negatively impacted by rocky transitions from one parent's household to another?
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge that these transitions are really difficult for kids, even if we do our best to kind of make them as seamless as possible. So it's just tough. Most of the time I do hear parents will say, as soon as they get home from the other parent's house, they're like a different kid, right? And then sometimes we go right to, well, what's going on at the other parent's house, right? And it could just be transitions are really difficult. So they're going back and forth from two separate places, and sometimes that's hard. So we don't want to, I like the phrase downloading, right? So sometimes our kids get in the house and we want to download them for all information they have, whether they're returning from school or whether they're returning from another parent's house, right? So being mindful not to download them, kind of back off them a little bit, right? Let them kind of, it's almost similar to when we transition home from a difficult day at work and we don't want someone in our face asking us all these questions, right? We might just need time to chill. Understanding that just because a child engages in problem behaviors when they get home from another parent's house doesn't necessarily mean there was something going on at the other house. It could just be what we see transitioning. If you want to ask questions about how things were going, ask them, but I would wait a little bit and not be something that's kind of interrogating, right? Because kids never want to feel like they're in the middle. So asking those kind of questions of like, how were you? How are things? Even things, we want to be mindful of some of the things that are well-meaning that we say. So when our kids get home and we say, I'm so happy to see you, that's great, right? To say that. Sometimes when we're like, oh my God, I missed you so much. Being mindful of whether your kid is thinking to themselves, oh, really? Like that makes me kind of sad. So even sometimes our well-meaning things when we have transitions could have an impact.
So you're saying there's another opportunity for intentional communication,
Yes.
specifically on these transitions.
Mm-hmm.
And I know transitions are very important. When we're driving on the interstate, we take those curves very slowly rather than yanking the wheel and smacking everybody's head into the window, right? These transitions can be quite difficult. Are there some specific pitfalls we should watch out for, especially during these transition times from one house to another?
That's a great analogy. Yeah, we don't want to hit our heads on the windows, right? So I would say for the most part, with our transitions, we want to be predictable, right? But we want to be able to have some flexibility, right? So we want our kids to be somewhat comfortable with that flexibility, but we want to be predictable. They want a schedule. So you're going to be at this house at this time, and then you're going to be back to this house at this time, right? So having kind of that predictability in their schedule, knowing what your communication with the co-parent can be at that time, right? So kind of having, this may not be when a kid is transitioning, this may not be the time to bring up with the co-parent what you're going to do for Thanksgiving, right? Might not be the time. So you might have kind of this rushed thing. It is that transition. Both of you just might not be in a space to do it at that time. So being intentional about what you choose to bring up at that time, so you're not really getting into a conflict right at transition time. Like I said before, not downloading a kid as soon as they get into your home, and really just giving them kind of that time to decompress, and understanding that if they are engaging in some kind of behaviors that you think are different, giving them that time, and then maybe trying to figure out why it was that they engaged in those.
I think that would be very easy to overlook, that transition time is maybe not the best time to have other conversations, and that maintaining the open lines of communication with the co-parent is important so that those conversations can happen in a more appropriate context then.
Yeah, maybe it's the time of like, hey, I really want to talk about Thanksgiving. Can we pick a day and time that we're going to do it? Gives the person time to think about it. Maybe that person didn't know you were going to ask that. You ask it, they get defensive, potentially, and it becomes a thing. And then the transition's already difficult anyway.
So we're, again, avoiding being reactive and intentionally being proactive about that communication.
Yeah.
So you said something interesting there about even saying something positive, like I've missed you, could add a stressor to that transition for a child or for children in the transition. So how can things like giving praise or the opposite, giving punishment or communicating expectations to children, that can happen quite differently from one co-parent to another. How does those inconsistencies factor into our children's mental health?
Yeah, well, what is so interesting, I think, about discipline, for lack of a better word, right? Or setting those expectations or having consistent consequences is that you will hear a lot of times in married couples the same thing.
Mm.
So one parent may let something go while the other parent doesn't. So communicating, okay, what are the consistent expectations we're going to have for the child? And then what will our consequences be? Overall, when it comes to discipline strategies, sticking with reinforcement, being very direct with kids. So reinforcing them for appropriate behavior that you see, being very intentional with your communication. So what you like, what it is that you would like them to improve on, being consistent with their consequences. And that's a big one to get on the same page with, because if you have, let's say, a child who didn't turn in their homework, and at one parent's house, that means they lose their phone for 24 hours, right? But then at another parent's house, it's nothing. You're really gonna you're not going to probably change that behavior. A child may just learn, well, I'll make sure that if I'm not going to turn my homework in, it's at the parent's house that doesn't have a consequence. Or there's this feeling of being upset at the other parent that is holding kind of more strict consequences as a result of behavior.
Well, and that isn't unique to co-parenting
Nope.
situations, correct? And there's obviously, I think, a tendency for us to overcompensate for the other person. If someone is being too lax in their discipline, then we may feel we need to cinch things down tighter, or vice versa. If we think the other parent is too strict, we might try to give the kids a break. So how do we communicate with a co-parent situation so that we can create some consistencies there? I love the predictability you keep talking about, that our children thrive on this stability and the predictability and consistency in there. How can we communicate that with a co-parent?
I think you can communicate directly based on what it is you see and why you think you're seeing it. And the more proactive in general when it comes to discipline, the better. So sometimes we always want to go right to consequences, right? So when so and so engages in this behavior, what are we going to do about it, right? Instead of, okay, let's be proactive and preventative. So maybe you have noticed that your child is yelling at their sibling more than normal, right? Or more than you usually see. Saying to the other parent, I feel like so and so has been yelling at his sister more than he usually does. I'm not really sure what is going on with that, but this is what I have been doing. I've been stopping the behavior and then saying we don't speak to each other this way. So can you keep an eye on that this weekend and let me know if that works for you? And if it doesn't work for you, let me know and maybe we could try something different. So kind of being proactive with communicating how you're going to do it, but also what you can do to prevent it. Most of the times kids will engage in behavior in order to get some sort of need met, right? So if you're able to look at what they're engaging in, why aren't they handing in their homework? Is it because they can't do the math well and maybe we should work more on the math? Is it because they're, on their phone? Is it because if they're a teenager, maybe they're in a conflict with a friend and they're just so obsessed with that conflict that they're not doing it? So talking as much as you can with the co-parent about why you think the behavior is occurring so that you can be on the same page.
So less focusing on the dire consequences of what we're going to do, but also that's really good about communicating what you are doing and why you're doing it. It opens up more opportunity for conversation about the circumstances surrounding your children.
And it helps with kids too. So kids want to know if I'm a kid, if I'm a teenager and I'm losing my phone for 24 hours, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want to know when you focus on the behavior and you focus on whatever skill it is that you're trying to work with them. It's very helpful to communicate that, because then it doesn't become, oh, well, mom took my phone because she's just awful and she's in a bad mood. And it becomes, well, you didn't turn in your math homework. And sometimes I feel like when you're on your phone so much, it's making you a little more anxious. So I would like us to get on some sort of schedule where you can do your responsibilities, but then also have time for your phone. So let's discuss what that could look like. But for the time being, I'm going to take it for 24 hours, if that's something that you were going to do. But it works, I think, for the co-parent, but also works for the kid to know this isn't just me having justice, right? This is me trying to teach you and show you how to be flexible with your phone and also take your responsibility seriously.
And what it sounds like you're saying is absolutely, as a parent, my responsibility to communicate to the co-parent the current situation. If someone has been grounded or had their phone taken away or something, it's my responsibility to communicate that, not to expect my child to communicate the current situation they're in, correct?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. You definitely want to say these are the things, and you want to do that proactively as much as you can with those lines of communication, because you don't want to be in a situation. And again, this isn't unique to co-parents, right? But you don't want to be in a situation where someone comes back to or goes to another parent and says, oh, I lost my phone for 24 hours. That parent is not on board with that and is like, oh, I can't believe that occurred. And then, because kids will capitalize on that, whether they are in with married parents or co-parents, they will capitalize and they will know which parent they can go to. So you always want to be consistent with those consequences.
So in some ways, some of these co-parenting situations can be more stable only because of the intentionality about making sure that it is a predictable environment, right?
Right, absolutely, because you're going out of your way to make sure you communicate and you're proactive, because it's really hard as co-parents to not feel as if they're in control when their child is with the other parent, and accepting that you're not in control, right? You're not in control when they're with that other parent. So as much as you can work with the other parent for not having so much control, but focusing on that consistency and why that consistency benefits your child if you're both on the same page with that.
That's wonderful. If I can, I'd like to take us just one different direction a little bit here, and that was to talk about extended family members, because a lot of our conversation has centered around the relationship with our children and the relationship with our co-parent and where that fits in. But of course, there's a lot more family members on either side. And what role and what importance would you say extended family members play in the lives of children who have co-parents?
It's a great question, and it is a difficult thing to navigate. So I think when we go through the divorce process, the separation process, a lot of people will say not only did they grieve the relationship and the future of the relationship, but they also grieved the loss of their family. So they felt as if they had that extended family and there was a loss there. What's usually really difficult post divorce and post separation is the grief of the extended family members. So here you are the one going through the separation and the divorce, and you're trying to work with your child's grief as well. But now you're comforting your mom, or you're comforting your mother-in-law, or you're trying to make them feel better because they're going through that grief as well. So acknowledging that there is that grief process, that your relationship with them is going to change, that there will be a time where extended family members may just not, they don't know what to do.
Mm.
right? So just if you want to maintain a relationship and that's something that's important and it's important for your children, just letting them know, which is tough because you're going through your own stuff, but I know this is hard for you, but I just want you to know that I value our relationship and the relationship you have with my children, and I'm going to work with that. You take the time that you need, but know you can reach out when you want to. When there's high conflict, I would say just draw boundaries, very
Mm.
specific boundaries, so that you're not engaging with somebody that is in high conflict, where you can say like, this is the way that I expect to be spoken to. Same thing with your kids. When your kids are around extended family members, sometimes you might find out from your kids that they are engaging in kind of negative talk in front of them. So again, same thing, being very specific. Like, I understand that you might be angry at me right now, if that's what it is. But I would appreciate that you do not discuss this in front of kids because
Yeah.
it's not good for them. So really having those boundaries as well.
Any tips or tricks specifically on those boundaries or expectations that we should communicate to extended family?
I would say, again, while taking into consideration their grief, so having some empathy if you can, right? I know that this is tough for the parents of my ex because they feel as if they're not going to see the kids as much. So, kind of having a little bit of empathy that there might be fear there wrapped up in things, that they might be grieving the loss of the other person that they had a relationship with. So, initially having that empathy, being as direct as you can with your communication. So, if the goal was to maintain the relationship, I'm here when you want to talk. Let me know if you want to have a plan for when you can see the kids. Not always necessarily going through the other parent if that's not necessarily beneficial.
Yeah.
So if you can have that relationship and keep those lines of communication open. And then, yes, if it is a situation where it is high conflict, just being very direct in your communication and your expectations, and responding rather than reacting, so that you're not pulled into the conflict as well.
Yes. Maybe the theme today is responding,
Yeah.
not reacting.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't even realize that, but I think it is. And
I
it's
like
so
it.
hard to do. It's so
Hmm.
hard. It's hard in general, but when things are emotionally charged, we go right to the part of our brains that processes emotions, and less to the part of our brains that process responding, taking a deep breath. It's almost
Yeah.
turned off. So as much as we can kind of practice that like a muscle, the better we get. And we see, as much as we can feel as if we're in an emotionally charged situation, or we will be, and then have our coping skills for,
Oh,
okay, what do I need to do? Do I need to take a breath? Do I need to say, I need 30 seconds and then I will be right back, kind of thing?
yeah.
Being prepared to do that.
So it's not a binary, you're either good at it or bad at it.
Mhm.
It's a process that you're going to have to build towards. And then maybe one day you get your certificate that you're good at
Yes.
not
And
reacting
then,
emotionally.
yes.
Well, this has been so good, Jessica. Thank you so much. And I want to open up. We're going to have people ask some questions as well. But before I do that, are there any other thoughts you wanted to say or any advice you wanted to give for parents in these co-parenting situations?
Sure. I guess I would just, and I look forward to the questions. I would just like to leave us with, there are definitely things that we can do to help our kids socially, emotionally, with mental health, regardless of our current family situations. So if our families look different, and there are things that we can do, and every single bit counts. So if you're in a situation right now that is super high conflict, any little bit that you can do to reduce it a little bit will help your kids. and giving yourself some grace, right? So, again, to go back to reacting versus responding, even after you get your certificate, you're going to have a bad day, right? You're going to have a time where you're going to be like, oh, I can't believe that I reacted that way. And that's okay. So, knowing that you're coming from a place of emotions, we're emotional human beings. So, giving yourself some grace that, okay, every day I can start anew. And if there's one little thing that I can do to reduce the conflict or to help make this transition easier for my kids or my co parent, that's a successful day.
Jessica, thank you so much. Oh my goodness. What you're saying there about even giving ourselves grace, giving ourselves permission to give ourselves grace, I think that's easier said than done. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes we're the toughest on ourselves, but we also find that when we are able to be empathic with ourselves, we're able to give that empathy a little bit more to others. And so it works both ways a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're trying to model the behavior for our children that we want them, and we want our children to give themselves grace. Well,
Oh,
we've got a couple of
absolutely. Yeah.
questions that have
Yeah.
come
And,
in.
and a lot of ways that we will sometimes say, when, as psychologists, when people are being really hard on themselves, like, what would they want to say to their child if their child was in the same situations? So, what kind of empathy would they show their child? In a lot of ways, if you kind of have yourself go back to that, you can check into, okay, I really am kind of tough on myself. I can have a little bit more empathy for the tough situation I'm in.
Yeah, oh, that's so good. So we've had a couple of questions come in already. I thought I'd throw some of these out here and see how you'd respond to some of these. We have one that says here, what if my co-parent is not willing to coordinate with me to keep our parenting styles and our punishment consistent?
Well, yeah, it goes back to the communication things that we were discussing earlier. I would, if you could in any way, try and figure out what your goal was for the child in terms of specific behaviors and specific skill development. Almost like we're going back to what we would do if we were coordinating with a teacher, right? What are the skills you want your child to get behaviorally, and what are the problem behaviors you're seeing, and then how you're going to be on the same page with responding. The most important thing, just from a behavioral science standpoint, and I don't want to get too wonky about it, but if you're inconsistent with how you respond to behavior, then you're not going to see much change. So whatever way you could communicate to the co-parent that if we're inconsistent with punishment procedures, let's say one person might punish a behavior, the other parent does not, that inconsistency doesn't tend to change behavior. But if there is consistency, so when we see this behavior, we're going to respond this way. When we see this behavior, we're going to respond this way. We're going to work on these skills. You might start to see a change. So trying to, I think, stay as behavior centric, specific to the child as possible. So, what is it that we're saying? What do we want to change? And can we be really objective in how we respond?
That seems to call for an uncomfortable level of maturity on the parent's part to understand. If I hear what you're saying is that maybe both co-parents have an objective, but neither can obtain that objective if they're fighting against each other. So really, it's in everyone's best interest to find some kind of solution that can be agreed upon.
Yeah, in general, when it comes to children and kind of parenting those kind of behaviors, whether co-parents or together parents, it's that depersonalization, right? So this child's behavior is not directed at me. It's serving some sort of need. And can I define this behavior, be objective about it, take the depersonalization out of it so that I respond consistently at this in the same way? And then that is magnified when you're trying to get someone else who has their own emotional needs and things that they bring to the table that might personalize it as well. So I would say Whenever you can come back to the child's needs, the child's behavior, the child is the focus, it would reduce that personalization of it.
That's interesting because even when things are simpatico, it's challenging enough to be on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings up another question that we have here. It says here from Lindsay asked, my ex and I have a very high conflict relationship. We started co-parenting therapy and made very little progress. My individual therapist recommended parallel parenting, which I do with my older kids and works beautifully. The therapist is adamant we not parallel parent, which I cannot understand. How can I create my own personal boundaries if things are so high conflict? Maybe you could start by helping define parallel parenting as well.
Yeah, so it is really interesting. And I feel like, Lindsay, it must be tough what you're going through, because it is really tough, I think, to co-parent in high conflict. With parallel parenting, there really is the limiting of kind of communication as much as you can, and there is really almost like siloed type parenting, right? So there is usually when you see really high conflict where you can say this is doing more harm than good, right? So we're in those situations where the communication is super poor, the conflict is really high. So siloing kind of these are the boundaries, these are how we do things. As long as you feel as if the child is safe in both of those homes, then getting on the same page is just, in the situation you're in, probably the cost benefit analysis is better. And your situation is really difficult for me, I think, to comment on this because I'm not really sure why a therapist would be adamant about it without really knowing your story. But I would say, looking at the costs and benefits, if there is any progress in trying to increase communication, if you start to see conflict is less when we just silo things out, and then again going back to the child. So are you seeing any red flags? Are you seeing any behaviors you're concerned about? Does it seem to be working? And then maybe there's a goal. Maybe there's a small goal of, okay, well, we're going to do it this way, but maybe the goal is that we can possibly coordinate something once a month to have a conversation. So those little baby steps, but it's a tough one because I'm not sure why a therapist would recommend against it without knowing the situation.
Yeah, that's a challenge. Again, all these questions are very similar along the same lines because Cindy's asking, how do I deal with an inconsistent parent? She says there are court orders in place, but the other parent shows up to pick up my toddler whenever they feel like it. My toddler cries every time they leave with the other parent because they're just not used to them. It's a tough situation.
Oh, Cindy, yes. So I would say some of the hardest part about co-parenting, parallel parenting, is that we don't control the other person and we have different things in place, but focus on what you can control is your time with your child, and then also how you're able to help support your child with those transitions. So what we know from the research in child psychology is that one consistent loving parent is enough, right? So if you guys walk away with anything, no, one consistent loving parent is enough. So you might feel like really distraught and upset that there is kind of this inconsistency that you can't control, but you can control you. Going back to what we talked about earlier, letting your child know, I think you said toddler, that they're safe and their safety is predictability. I know that's tough when you have a parent that is just showing up to pick up a child. So being as much as you can predictable and consistent in your own home, trying to manage those transitions as much as you can, trying to figure out what it is about the child that is resistant when it is time to go. Talking to them when you have a toddler, you might get more out of play. So utilizing play when you're playing with maybe, well, two wouldn't be Legos, but dolls or something like that, using like play kind of things. I don't want anybody to choke on Legos. Two might be too young for that, but utilizing play to kind of get what their emotional experience is.
Yeah. Well, we actually had a question from another viewer who asked, when I'm in these situations, what can I do to avoid having to bring that stuff up in person in front of the kids? Because that transition time, it appears, is the only time that there's even an opportunity for communication.
Well, I would say maybe if you could schedule something, right? If that isn't doable, you could go old school, where if you remember, teachers would, and some still do, would send home their communication book with their child. So you could physically write in a communication book if you feel as if the electronic communication may not be working. So kind of physically writing, here are how things, and then have like targeted prompts. So if you are in a situation where you can't necessarily speak to the other co-parent, maybe there's targeted prompts. How was their day? What went well? Did they eat? Those kind of things. The broken record technique tends to work kind of well in high conflict. So you just keep saying the same thing over and over again. Sometimes it can be frustrating, right? But it helps you kind of detach from things. So ways that you can plan out communication, so that you're not in, again, those transition times are so stressful in general that it's usually not the time to bring up things. It's usually really difficult, even if you're not in a high conflict situation. So kind of planning out when you'll do that.
Okay. Worst case scenario, we send a registered letter by certified mail, and we make sure somebody signs they got a receipt of the communication.
Right. Can you fill out what was for dinner? Yeah.
There you go. Well, let's pivot a little bit here. There's an interesting question from Jessica. She's asking, what advice would you have about religion if the other parent doesn't share the same belief system?
Jessica, good name. So I would say this is something that would not be unique to any parent, together or not together. So it really will just have to be something that two people navigate, and figuring out what aspects of religion you want to incorporate, what aspects of religion that your co-parent may be resistant to, understanding that you may not have a co-parent that is on the same page with the religion that you choose, but you could certainly still.
Oh, I think just for a sec we may have cut that video feed. We'll come back. I think what we're talking about here probably also applies to politics as well as religion. They're all of the topics that are almost guaranteed to start a fight at Thanksgiving, right? So whether it's religion or Thanksgiving, whether it's religion or politics, and we disagree on this, whether we're co-parenting or not, it's going to cause some challenges.
So I was kicked off for a little bit, but I don't know if you guys saw me go away, but I think I
just for
might have got the tail end of what you said. So yes, there are certain things that even in intact families, or however we want to call them, are off limits, right? And it's usually religion and politics. So in the same way, what aspects do you want? And you don't want your religion to be the source of conflict. So putting things in place where if there is just resistance, then maybe it is just something that you do in your home, and knowing, again, kind of that relinquishing of control, which is really difficult, that you cannot control the other person and whether or not they would be supportive.
So what about in a situation where there's quite distinctly non-supportive communication happening in the other household, let's say. Because Joseph's asking, how do I handle a situation where my ex is constantly telling my 5-year-old things about our divorce, causing him to be confused and unsure if I love him?
Oh, it's really, really difficult. I would say first, if you are able to be in a situation where you can say, speaking about a parent this way, the other parent this way is very detrimental to the child. What is really specific about this situation is what ends up happening when a parent badmouths another parent in front of the child is that it doesn't necessarily change the way they feel about the parent that's badmouthed. It changes the way they feel about the parent that is badmouthing.
Ooh.
And sometimes reminding people of that. I want you to, so Joseph, with your co-parent, saying to your co-parent, I want you to have the best relationship with our child that you can. And just know that when you badmouth him or badmouth me to him, it might change the way he feels about you. And then I would just say what you can control. So you can be a home of predictability and love and reminding your son of how much you love him, so you can kind of work in with what you can control.
Regardless of what anybody else says, making sure your child knows how much you love them.
Yes.
Man.
Yeah.
Again, go a little bit of a different direction here. Let's talk about introducing other people into the co-parenting situation, because at some point there's a distinct possibility that one or the other co-parents may start to move on in a different direction with their lives. And so we have a question here that says, my co-parent thinks that introducing our child to a new significant other within a couple months instead of a year of dating or relationship is okay, and thinks that the year time frame is just a recommendation. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think the time thing is arbitrary. Okay. I think the most important thing, and the reason why there is a time thing, is that you want to make sure it's consistent. If you're going to introduce someone to your children, you want to be reasonably certain that it's going to be consistent, because that inconsistency is going to make them not feel safe. So whether it's a couple months or a year, I think the reason why the year is recommended is because you think that if it has been a year, there's more of a likelihood that there's going to be consistency there. So with this co-parent, I would ask the question of why it is that you feel after a couple months there may not be consistency here, if this was a pattern, because it is detrimental to kids. It can be, to have adults in and out of their lives. So knowing before you introduce someone that there's a reasonable chance that it's going to be consistent. Can you be 100% sure? No, absolutely you can't. But knowing that there's going to be a reasonable chance that there is some consistency, and doing it gradually. You don't want to, what's interesting is sometimes if you wait a long time, you go in terms of the eyes of the child of 0 to someone maybe moving in. Mm-hmm. And they don't see that there was this year, right? They're not really seeing that. So being mindful of, regardless of how much time you wait, you want to go through that relationship development stage with your children gradually, so that they understand, and not so quickly of, well, you didn't know that I was seeing this person for a year and now we're getting married, right? That's going to be really difficult for them to understand.
That's such a good perspective, is to start looking at it as an issue of stability for the child, regardless of how I as a co-parent may emotionally feel about the situation happening in the other co-parent's side is to separate that out and understand that it's about the stability, which has been such a theme for us in this talk. If you could just remind me again, you said they're looking for stability, connection, I believe agency, and there was a fourth one that I'm missing.
No, those were the big three.
Okay, the big three.
Yeah. So safety, which is predictability.
Safety. Okay.
Connection, and agency. So if you go back with your kids and think to yourself when you're in conflict with a co-parent or going back to those things, what do I need to do to make sure my child feels safe? And guys, this goes from newborns to your teenagers. How can I make sure they're safe, which is usually that their environment is predictable? How can I make sure they feel connected? And how can I make them feel as if they have some control? They have some agency over the situations. What are the little choices that you can give them so they don't feel as if everything is just happening around them and they can't really control it?
I love that. That helps put the situation of a co-parent introducing a new relationship into a different frame of reference, I think, when we look at it and say, well, how does this affect their stability and their safety? Mm-hmm. How does this affect their ability to connect? And how does it affect their sense of agency that they can have some say in the situation? That's really good.
Absolutely. And you'll be able to put their behavior in that context too. So it helps with the discipline aspect of things or the behavior support aspect of things, because you'll be able to see their behavior in terms of what needs they're trying to get met, and more from a standpoint of empathy and less from a personalization.
So Frankie asked here, and this is a little bit of a longer question, but he's asking, are there tips on how to approach the other parent who refuses to co-parent and always says things like, I'm all set, we don't need help with homework, I live an hour away from the other parent, and my only communication with the other parent is through text on the Talking Parents app. I've tried empathy, asking if we can communicate differently, asking what can I do to help with the situation. She has said she wants to move to parallel parenting. I'm a very patient person and love to communicate and resolve issues, but I've hit a roadblock.
Oh, it's tough. You're not going to change the other person, which I'm sure you know, who wants to do that parallel parenting. Maybe if you could, I know you already said that communication is really poor, but maybe if you got on the same page as to what aspects of parallel parenting the co-parent values and what aspects of co-parenting that you value, and see if there is a way to kind of do some sort of mesh with that. But that's a really difficult one when somebody is kind of set into that they don't want to communicate. You can't force someone to hear you, which is really difficult. So you can try, but you can't force someone to communicate with you. So again, that's when I go back to telling yourself, this is the household and this is the relationship that I control. And I'm going to put the needs of my child first. And I'm going to do what it is that I can in the boundaries of what I can control, because I can't change someone else.
Right. We, in the pie chart of the entire problem, I don't know if 90% of that is somebody else's issue, but the only part I can work with is my little 10% wedge of dealing with the issue at hand. Yeah, this is challenging.
It's really hard. Yeah.
We actually had a couple of questions here, but one of these goes back to that safety conversation we were talking about because a viewer asked and said the custodial parent has alienated the other parent and the kids are now frightened to share what's going on in the house, at school, or at other activities. So, how can I be an active parent in this situation?
Being that safe space. So when we go back to kids don't want to feel as if they're interrogated, you can get information from children without asking directly. So maybe there are some interesting strategies with kids, adults too. People tend to open up more when they're side by side versus face to face. So car rides sometimes are helpful. Going for a walk sometimes are helpful. Kids tend to communicate when they're doing something else, so that you might be able to get some information when you're doing something else, such as like playing a game or something like that. Kids also communicate through their behavior, and we forget that. We think that kids will only communicate to us this way, but they communicate through their behavior. So if you start to notice changes in your kid and you're like, this is just not, I mean, we have universal red flags. So changes to eating, changes to mood, changes to sleeping habits. But anything can be a red flag when it's different for your kid. So you know your child better than anybody else. So if you start to see some changes, they're communicating through their behavior that something is off. So when you start to see those things, you can try and get information without necessarily asking questions directly. Because we all know that you ask a kid a question directly and they're going to be like, my day was fine. School was fine. Everything was fine. They'll also pick up on your energy too. So making sure you're in a good space when you're asking so that they don't feel, because if you have one parent that's alienating the other with the child, they may feel that when you're asking questions, they're put in that situation too. So that they might kind of put a wall up and get defensive. So knowing if it's a good time for you to ask those questions.
And gosh, that's got to be challenging identifying behavioral changes because children are already somewhat mercurial and you're wondering why grades are going down. Is this a pattern or is it a bad week? And so in any situation, trying to extract data from the noise in all of that is quite challenging.
Of course. And if we're in a conflict situation, we have that story in our head. So knowing that we might first go to, of course, this is because of this. My son, who is very insightful and he's 11, will sometimes call me out on this because he might, I don't know, get kind of testy with me or something. And I'll say like, oh, well, what happened? Did you not have a good day at school? And he's like, no, it's you, actually. It's you. My school day was fine. But that's what we do, right? Like we put kind of our story onto our kids. I train on this. I still do it where I have to be like, oh yeah, it could actually be me. I am kind of in your face and you just got home and you might have had a great day. So yeah.
So you talked about we sometimes put up these walls because we as co-parents may not feel safe. And Megan asks a question that's quite pertinent to that very topic because she says, my co-parent will only answer phone calls when scheduled ahead of time with prior knowledge of the topics and will only allow like a daily logistics and immediate needs conversation of our son to be spoken about at pickup. Extremely brief pickups and our son's medical appointments are the only time he will be near me. I'm trying to respect his rather extreme boundaries at the advice of our co-parent counselor. Do you have any advice on how to possibly open up this communication?
That is a tough one. And what I would say is without knowing all the logistics of the situation is maybe you establish a goal for yourself that you want in terms of communication and start really, really small. So I didn't really hear in that question what you felt like you wanted to gain out of more increased communication. So what I would say is
Mm,
figure out what it is you want to get from more increased communication, and then maybe start small. So respecting those boundaries. But if you are in a situation where you say, I feel like I miss some aspects of something that is impacting our child, and if we could talk here, that may be helpful. But again, always going back to the child, but figuring out
yeah.
what it is you want to get from that so that you can communicate that directly, because we want to hear, well, what it is that you want. Why do you think this would be a goal? And if we always go back to the child and benefiting the child, then that helps, rather than I'd like to talk to you more because I want to hear more, right? So kind of having a specific goal.
That's good. I think it's come up a few times where it seems we are tempted to be distracted by the process and lose sight of what we're actually trying to achieve. We might get a little bit wrapped up in the specifics of the situation right now and lose sight of the fact that what are we really trying to accomplish here? And if we can define that for ourselves a little better, then we'll know how maybe we can get there.
Yes, absolutely. So kind of having that goal directed behavior and having it be specific to our child, and then also our own mental health and well-being, and the relationship. So sticking to those three things.
Let me ask you a behavioral question that came in from Nikki. She asked, how would you handle temper tantrums? I have a 17-month-old son who has started following his older cousin's example by throwing himself on the floor, screaming and crying when he does not get something he wants or doesn't go his way.
Nikki, I love a behavior question. And I would say, again, I'm sorry that the psychologist in me always has to say I can't be real specific because I don't know everything. But I would say for a typically developing child, 17 months is not uncommon to see temper tantrums. And I would look at when you start to see them. So, what happens before, what happens after, and how you're responding, because likely how you're responding is meeting some sort of need for the child if you continue to see the temper tantrum. But what I would say is, while frustrating, at 17 months it is not uncommon at all to see a temper tantrum in a child.
Right. That
Yeah.
this is part of where a child is at that point in life. Because we have another question with a similar age. Kenya's asking, how can I be a better co-parent with one that doesn't understand we need to have a routine for our 2-year-old?
Control the routine in your own house.
Yeah.
So you can try to communicate with that co-parent, but again, if it's high conflict and you can't, but whatever routine in your own home that you can be predictable with, and then also predictability with them going to the other co-parent's home, and whatever ways you can try and make meaningful progress on how important predictability is for a child. But going back to, okay, what can I do in this house to make sure that my child always feels safe and that there is predictability?
That's again, there was another question very similar to that about how do we try to match up our parenting styles when, of course, there are issues we disagree on. How do we match up on our punishment systems?
I would sometimes, I feel like it's helpful if you can map out almost like a behavior support plan, for lack of a better way of saying it, that can travel from house to house. Almost like we were discussing what you would do at school when you would write out how someone's day was. So
Mhm.
these are the strategies we're going to use. Maybe you have a token board for a 17-month-old that has temper tantrums. So maybe if they engage in behaviors that you like to see, they get like little tokens and they love their token board, or something that they travel with, but very specific strategies. Remember, our kids want to know it too. from small kids to bigger kids, they want to know, if I engage in this behavior, this will be the consequence. So writing down a family behavior support plan of, this is how we respond to lying. This is how we respond to technology violations. This is how we respond to temper tantrums. Really mapping it out as best you can and writing it down on paper and having it travel back and forth so that you're not always on the fly.
Okay, let me ask then, since you brought up boundaries, what about boundaries that don't involve the children but actually are between the co-parents themselves? I wanted to ask, see if we could pick your brain a little bit about how do we establish some of those relational boundaries now in the new co-parenting relationship? Because Hugo asked, how can I respond to the other person when they badmouth me on the Talking Parents app? I usually ignore it as it does not pertain to the kids. However, what would be a good way to avoid conflict on my part?
I would say it's a great question. So I would have a standard response to things like that, right? So if your boundary is, I expect you to respectfully engage in conversation with me, and I'm not going to respond to disrespectful behavior, doing that broken record of when someone does try, you could try and figure out what the point of the behavior was. So was it an attempt to kind of bait some sort of communication, which sometimes it is, but having that broken record response, and it works for kids too, of, I would prefer if you spoke to me this way. If you have specific things you would like to discuss, let me know. And the response comes back, same thing. I would prefer if you. Sometimes not responding to could work if it is something where, if you even do the broken record, it's just going to kind of take your day. But again, whatever emotion you can take out of it, and it's not easy when somebody is, coming at you and saying things that you don't appreciate, but whatever you can do to take the emotion out and then just have that broken record response, because typically people have a reason for wanting to do it, and their reason is to engage. So if you don't engage and you have the same kind of standard response, then you would expect that the behavior would start to extinguish.
Just because of the wasted effort that goes in with that, if I keep saying over
I'm
and
getting
over.
nothing out of this. Yeah, like I'm getting nothing out of this. You're just responding the same way. Yeah.
So it's okay to say, I'm not going to respond to profanity, or that's inappropriate, I can't respond to that.
Absolutely. Yep. And in a lot of ways, what it is also helpful is to say what you will do, and what you do expect.
Okay.
Works with kids too. So we tend to kind of sit with the, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And with everybody, we want to tell people what to do. I expect you to communicate with me respectfully. You can say that to your child, you can say that to your co-parent. Respectful communication looks like this. You don't curse at me, kind of thing. I don't want to be accused of things. So being very direct about what it is you expect, instead of, because there is almost an accusation in when you say, don't do that. So when you do kind of take that ownership and agency and say, I expect you to communicate with me this way, and this is what that looks like, it puts the ownership back on you. And it's harder to fight with that. Because then if you say, well, don't speak to me that way. Well, I wasn't. And it's like, well, I expect you to speak to me that way. Well, I did. Well, it looks like this, right? And then that's it. It's kind of done.
That's a nice tool that you've given here, is to say, I can start my response with, I expect, or I don't expect even, we could say, if we needed to flip it around, because I know for me personally, a life motto has been that uncommunicated expectations are unmet expectations. And so saying what you expect rather than the frustration with the communication, instead say, this is what I expect you to, this is the language I expect you to use when you communicate with me.
Yes, we expect people to mind read and most of the time people will mind read the wrong thing. So we don't want to expect people to mind read, and we don't want to mind read. So as clear as we can be in our communication, the better.
That's so good. I think we need to wrap this up, but I wanted everyone to know that we will send out an email with the full webinar to anybody who registered, and it'll be available a little later on the website. But Jessica, I can't thank you enough. Dr. Kendorski, this time has been so uplifting. I feel a lot more educated from this too, but I just appreciate the wisdom that you've been able to give us all today on especially some of these real world scenarios that people are struggling with right now.
Good. I'm so glad. Thank you for having me. I know this isn't easy, and it's a passion of mine, and I think we can improve. Any situation can be improved, even with baby steps. So thank you all for being here, and best of luck to you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.